Good evening or afternoon, friends. It's Reverend Will McGarvey at the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County with Father Tom Bonacci from the Interfaith Peace Project, bringing you part 2 of our series on coping with nationalisms. Tonight, we'll be focusing on understanding the doctrine of discovery, its origins, and how it has continued to influence our culture until today. As we do so, of course, we recognize that we are on native land. And as an Interfaith Council, we understand land acknowledgements as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. As people of various faith traditions and life philosophies, we affirm our responsibility to amplify Indigenous voices. And so we stand in solidarity with local Indigenous communities and we respect local Indigenous protocol. We practice land acknowledgements in order to teach and promote greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, even here in California, where there are few First Nations that survived the California Indigenous genocide and fewer still that gained federal recognition as sovereign nations. For those places like Minnesota, where folks are still resisting Line 3, and others have gone on to the District of Columbia to press their treaty rights with the government, and especially our president, who hasn't recognized those treaty rights. We do so standing in solidarity with them, recognizing and honoring their matriarchal culture, and finding ourselves as fellow people of faith, fighting for their rights as we fight for those of Haitian immigrants and people of every life philosophy, creed, color, and faith tradition. Help me as we welcome Father Tom Bonacci in sharing our second installment on coping with nationalisms.
Thank you, Will. My blessings to all of you, and it is my blessing and privilege to be with you. In this series on coping with nationalism, in our first meeting, we attempted to come up with some operating definitions or some sensitivities concerning nationalism in general and Christian nationalism in particular. So let's do a little bit of review. There are several elements that constitute what we now call Christian nationalism. First, Christian nationalists by and large believe that America is defined by Christianity. Of course, the question would be, what do you mean by Christianity? And I hope to explore that a little bit today, and then also in our next session. 2, the government, therefore, should favor this Christianity over other religions and over other different forms of Christianity. 3, America was and is a Christian nation, willed and established by God. I think it's very, very important for us to understand that behind the construct Christian nationalism, as I understand it, is not simply that people are adhering to principles that they call Christian, but that the very nation itself, the very land on which we stand, has been ordered by God to be given to certain people. Therefore, it's not just simply a selection in faith, it's obedience to God's will and God's plan. 4, our freedom will be lost if we do not honor and adhere to the Christian identity by which God blessed America and established America. So when we talk about religious freedom, we have to be very, very careful with that, because for many people, oddly enough, and it may sound contradictory to fair-minded people, religious freedom would refer to that religion which is legitimate. Some have held philosophically that error has no rights. Therefore, if someone doesn't adhere to the truth as revealed by God, they lose their human rights. As a matter of fact, they may even lose their human dignity. The fifth element is that God blesses America And Christians have a right and a duty to ensure the Christian nature of the country. And that concerns not only matters religious and theological, but cultural. Interestingly enough, I would ask, does that include economic understanding and economic practice? Number 6. It's important for us to realize that many people that we would call Christian nationalists do not necessarily self-identify that way. They may simply call themselves American, patriotic, faithful citizens. They may be baffled by the term nationalist or nationalism. In any event, the fusion of government, politics, and Christianity are self-evident to them in their experience and in their belief. Christian nationalism, then, is a political ideology seeking to ensure the Christian religious identity of a nation as it's understood by particular people. The last element I would remind you of, I find rather painful. The rights of others, others than those who self-identify as Christian of a type, the rights of other people are secondary to the religious freedom of Christian nationalists. That's a very painful thing to say, because it's also suggesting that God only moves in certain directions and that everybody else can be perceived as being the enemy. Now, the question that I want to consider this evening or today is, where does this kind of thinking come from? I, as a Christian, could easily say that definition of Christianity is invalid, that the Christian nationalist understanding is simply wrong and not compatible with the tradition. But I must be honest, because when I look into the actual history of the church, and I look into the actual history of Christianity and the way it's been practiced through the centuries, I might discover that there are teachings that are highly influential that have led to the issue of Christian nationalism in the United States today. And one such element that we can discover is the doctrine of discovery. In other words, as we look back into the history of the church and we look back into the history of Christianity, we see that at a particular time in history, there was formulated something we now call the doctrine of discovery. And interestingly enough, the doctrine of discovery is not confined to the 15th century, but rather its implications are still with us today and are embedded in the way we understand who can own the land, who has the right to the land, to land titles, to land ownership. It's embedded in our economics, and it very, very well may be a major element in racism, especially as it exists in the United States today. So this rather painful development is something we have to look at honestly. And I'm not altogether sure that I can say, although I wish I could say, we can simply dismiss Christian nationalism and the doctrine of discovery as a perversion of Christianity. I'm not quite so sure it is. It may be the consequence of Christianity if we're not careful in what we're doing. In any belief system, we have to be aware of how that belief system can fester into a pathology that injures other people. Now, I would like to, first of all, before we talk about the doctrine of discovery in itself, is to share with you my emotions and my feelings. Because I think for many of us, when we begin to engage the history of the United States, the history of America, and begin to reconsider the history of the Christian community, those of us who claim to be Christian in particular may have some very deep emotions and feelings. Here's how I feel: shame, regret, remorse, anger, hurt, embarrassment, guilt, and the need to repent. I wish I could say that the Doctrine of Discovery and its ill effects on society and the damage that it did to very, very real people was an issue in the past, the fault of my ancestors, and it's not my fault. But as I pointed out to you before, because something is not my fault does not mean it's not my responsibility. Does not mean that I am exempt from considering it. The fact is, when I look into my own life, I become somewhat remorseful of how many years I spent living in the United States and on earth with no knowledge of this. I grew up when people who were the object of genocide were cartoon figures. When so-called Indians were stereotyped as pagans, barbarians, and savages. And as a little boy, week after week, going to the movies, watching cartoons where men, women, and children were stereotyped into animated characters that could be erased from history and consciousness. Never once did I ask the question, what does that really mean? What is that about? So I'm not simply trying to go on a guilt trip, but I think it's important for us to identify the feelings that we have and to be careful, because we can immediately say we want to respond to this before we even recognize what the issue is that we're dealing with. As we become more and more aware of the actual history of our nation, we must confront the truth of what actually happened. If any justice is to be rendered, and in this case in particular, to Indigenous people. Let's examine some of the slogans, some of the sayings that are embedded in our history. And we do so because embedded in much of this language is hate, fear, and prejudice. American exceptionalism. We, the people. All men are created equal. Liberty and justice for all. Make America great. Make America great again. America was discovered in 1492. Westward expansion, manifest destiny. And now the song that now breaks my heart, from sea to shining sea, God shed his grace on these. This kind of language is embedded in our founding documents. It's embedded even in our patriotism. It's embedded in our corporate imagination as a people. And yet it is the slogans of prejudice, and if not hate. And for some people, these words threaten their very existence and lives because it has destroyed their existence and lives. In fact, this land that we call our land was stolen from Indigenous people who lived here for time on end. How could this happen? How could this possibly be justified? What work was done in the Western European mind by which it became possible that those who were discovering the world on which they lived thought they had a right to it, thought they had the right to determine who a human being is, who had the right to live, and in fact, who needed to die. This is hard. It's very, very difficult, because it means when we start saying things like "we the people," what's the definition of a person? When we say all men are created equal, we can easily change that to inclusive language and say all people are created equal. But if we do so without reading the actual documents in which this terminology is embedded, we run the risk of not paying attention to the facts of history and the truth of our lives. We must realize that if indigenous peoples' lands were stolen and their lives destroyed, then we ourselves, who call ourselves the dominant community, may very, very well be traumatized by those events and the painful memory. That's why we may find ourselves in various stages of denial, revisionist history, or worse, blaming people for being here who should not have been here to begin with. Let's deepen this a little bit if we look at some of the founding documents in the United States. What we notice in the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, when first formulated, is the exclusion of women, no reference to women. We can see the ill effect of that in the society today, where women's rights and women's dignity is always compromised by powerful men in political high places. Women are excluded with no reference to women's existence. Black people, people of color, are reduced to 3/5 a human being. How on earth can you refer to somebody as 3/5 a human being? By what authority? What perspective can possibly come into your mind, heart, or soul by which women are excluded and people of color are considered 3/5 a human person? Indigenous people are called Indians and oftentimes associated with savages and barbarians that must be removed, as if they're obstacles to God's plan. How is this possible in a nation that considered itself to be a nation that was formed for the sake of freedom and against tyranny? The subsequent history of genocide, slavery, and the compromised rights of many must be understood if we are ever to find peace, and peace built on justice. Unfortunately, the crimes and the atrocities against indigenous people, to say the least, finds its roots in Christian religion. And those who gave us the doctrine by which indigenous people could be slaughtered were not some fringe group within the church, but in many cases, the church's highest authority and its best theologians. For we now know that our founders appealed to the doctrine of discovery that was a papal teaching in the 15th century in Europe. We also know that the doctrine of discovery has influenced Supreme Court decisions and still influences our society today. And as sad as it is for me to say, the doctrine of discovery has still not been repealed or apologized for in the highest levels of religious Christian authority. Let's reflect on the implications of this before we look at the doctrine itself. Here's what the doctrine of discovery actually says to real-eyed people. Here's what it says to indigenous people. And we'll see that this lays the foundation for much of the racism and the dismissal of certain people that's in our nation today. The doctrine of discovery implies that when you meet an indigenous person, you can actually say to them, you are not who you experience yourself to be. Your self-experience is irrelevant. We will tell you who you are. We have divine rights. We have divine certitude. We have divine teaching by which we will tell you who you are. Imagine if somebody came into your life and dismissed your own personal reflection, your own personal story, and told you who you are and what you mean even to yourself. You are not who you experience yourself to be. You are not what you think you are. I meet people of different traditions, different faith traditions. I meet people of no faith tradition. When I ask them who they are and how they self-experience, one young woman put it this way: I have no belief in God as such, but I believe that I am a child of the universe. I believe that everything beautiful in the universe created me in this moment. Who would I be to tell her that's not her experience? Today, we have powerful men telling women what it is to be a woman. We have oppressors telling people who are oppressed how they're not a human being. The doctrine of discovery actually gave us permission. Maybe it even required us to say to people who were here in their own land, you do not belong here. And finally, God gave us this land, and you are occupants. You are obstacles, and you must be removed. Now, you may think that I'm exaggerating this point. Sometimes I think I'm exaggerating this point. It couldn't possibly be that bad. Nobody in high church authority, nobody with a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, no one who believes that they are redeemed by the blood of the Lamb could possibly think they have the right to say to another person, especially a person they never met before, that you don't belong. You're not human. You shouldn't live. You are an obstacle, and God wants me to destroy you. I can see that in a fringe group. I can see that in someone who might be insane. I can see that in someone who might have criminal tendencies. But in the highest echelons of church authority, it's heartbreaking. Because sometimes I find myself with authority. And I wonder how many hearts I've broken. The doctrine of discovery is embedded, implied, and extracted from three papal documents in the 15th century. Let's look at them in particular. 1. June 18th, 1452, Pope Nicholas issued a decree, Dum diversus, authorizing the king of Persia to reduce any Muslim, pagan, or unbeliever to perpetual slavery. Born from such thought is the slave trade from West Africa. Reduced to slavery. Anybody who is not us, anybody who does not look like us, anybody who does not believe what we believe, he empowers the king, and therefore the king's army, to reduce to slavery the unbelievers. For if you don't believe what I believe, you're an unbeliever. I have nothing to learn from you. 2. On January the 5th, 1455, the same Pope Nicholas IV extends to Catholic nations of Europe dominion over discovered lands, encouraging the enslavement of native and non-Christian people in Africa and the so-called New World. Lands could now be discovered. The question's been asked by far greater commentaries than myself. How can you discover a land that's already been discovered? How you can discover a land in which people are already in it? What you mean is that you found it for the first time in your life, but you didn't discover it. It was already discovered by other people who may have related to the land very, very differently than you would. But now discovered land implies that even if there was somebody there, it's not their land. The land belongs to the discoverer. And the discoverer didn't discover people. The discoverer discovered land. And those people, so to speak, are the obstacle to my journey. And finally, Pope Alexander VI on May 4th, 1493, issued another papal teaching, an Inter Cateria, stating that one Christian nation did not have the right to dominate lands of another Christian nation. Oh, so if it's a Christian land, it can't be discovered. But if it's not a Christian land, it can be discovered. And the same permissions or orders were given. You may reduce them to slavery. You may treat them as you see fit. You might even eliminate them, all in the name of evangelization, in the name of proclaiming the gospel, in the name of uplifting the church, and the uplifting of Jesus's name through the world. I'm horrified. I'm actually horrified that anybody could come to an understanding that my Jesus, that his name could even be associated with this. I must do more work. Oddly enough, this established what some people thought was the law of nations, which was based on the superiority of Christian religion over every other religion. All of this together gives us 3 elements we must ponder. 1, discovery is only possible by European Christian men. The only people on the face of the earth who could discover anything were European Christian men. In other words, if they discovered the land under your feet and you were not a Christian, you should not exist. 2, if discovered people are not Christians and they do not yield to Christianity, they are illegal occupants, deemed to be uncivilized, barbarians, and savages. Now, here's why they were considered uncivilized and savage. Because they lived off the land. They lived with the land. They lived in cooperation with the land. Actually, the Europeans actually asked the question, where are the buildings? Where are the streets? Where's the garbage? How can you live off the land? If you live off the land, you must be a savage. If you interact with the land, if you believe that the land is sacred, you must be a pagan. Oh, you worship trees too? What do you mean you never take anything from the earth without thanking the Great Spirit? What do you mean you never take a fish out of the river without thanking the river? What do you mean that before you hunt an animal, you ask for his permission and reverence the spirit? That's paganism. That's uncivilized. We need streets. We need commerce. We need to create a society in which people dominate one another, not care for each other. These are savages and barbarians. To the point that it was perfectly okay that when I was a little boy, to take these people who could live off the land and live with the land and call them barbarians and savages and have us laugh when one of them was hurt in the cartoon. We even named sports teams after them, trying to access the barbaric nature. We took their sacred instruments, their sacred artifacts, and turned them into toys and weapons of violence. Finally, in fact, this is almost unbelievable. If they're not Christian, they're not human. One of the things that always troubled me in the practice of religion is how easy it is sometimes for people to damn one another. Because you don't believe what I believe, because you don't think what I think, you're worthy of damnation. We even sometimes say that to one another, damn you. I hope we don't know what we're saying. But if we don't know what we're saying, we should, because it ought not to be said, because it should never be done. You're not a human being. Not only do you not have any right to your experience of yourself, you don't have any right to your experience of your world. You don't have any right to what you experience. You don't have any right to being a human being. So I can say all people are created equal till I turn green. And it means nothing if I just dismiss the humanity of another person. But on the upside of this, 50 years after Alexander VI issued his decree, the Emperor Charles V, consulting some of the best theologians in the church, dissented from papal teaching and held that native people were the true owners of their own land. But I went to follow through with the research. It didn't go anywhere. Somehow or another, the damage of the Doctrine of Discovery set in. The damage was done. The
So,
idea
Father
is still
Tom,
alive today. Yes, well,
so I was wondering if, do you see that this is like exactly the reason why we didn't recognize Native freedom of religion until 1973?
I think absolutely so. I don't think we considered that. We didn't consider it religion. We considered barbaric practice.
So, as interfaith practitioners, when I share that information with folks, they are very surprised. They believe that freedom of religion was guaranteed for all people, not not just for white people, but that they were included in the constitutional guarantees. But I think there was a view by a lot of early Americans that said they're so other. It's what excused the residential schools, right? That we can steal your children in order to re-educate them in our schools because they're not fully human, because they're not the same religion as we are.
That's right. I think, to me, what's really behind all of these questions is not whether or not people have a right to practice their religion. It's the slow inability to come to the understanding that we're talking to other people
I
who
think
have a right to be.
we don't understand the treaty rights either that many First Nations have, that they negotiated with our own government, and our own government doesn't protect. We've broken all 750 of these treaties.
Well,
But
exactly. You don't have to be faithful to a treaty if the other person signing the treaty isn't a human being.
well, we didn't even give them the right to vote till 1978. It was after our 200th anniversary, our bicentennial, that we realized that they didn't have the right to vote in, if they only had a right to vote in their um, tribal elections if they had enough blood quantum according to our definitions for who was a real Native American. So even that whole system of blood quantum that said that if you're Native American and you marry someone who's not, then your children have 50%. If they marry someone who's not Native American, then they're down to 25%. It's almost as if they put that policy in to the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a way of trying to get rid of ever having to give any more money to First Nations ever again.
But notice the irony and the heartbreak in all of this. We give, we give, we give.
Yeah, it's out of
We
our generosity that we give to them.
we give them money, we give them rights, we give them the right to vote, we give them this, we give them that, and it's real. You see,
That's
it's
still the
still,
language we use.
which we still use the language that we own them, that somehow they're under our management.
And then it's okay if we mismanage the funds that are supposed to go to them, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs are supposed to be stewards of.
Yes, but when you steal money from somebody and you give it back, you don't get a thank you note.
True.
What happened here, what happened here in the history, of course, is not simply the destruction of land, not simply the robbing of land. It was the killing of people. We actually had systematic, legalized genocide. You may
True.
eliminate them. You can move them around, you can play with them like objects, and then they will become overwhelming to your vision. You may eliminate them. When you see the decrease in the population at this particular period of time in the founding of America, it's heartbreaking. The blood of spilt indigenous people cries out to this day. I get the feeling sometimes I can't walk an inch without stepping on the blood of somebody. And that blood is beginning to cry out to me terribly. And so we entertain ourselves sometimes with the idea that we're going to give them rights and we're going to give them money and we're going to give them land, as opposed to recognizing the fundamental crimes. I am sorry that my ancestors and myself have been complicit in the potential destruction of your people, in the destruction of your people. I am sorry. I don't know how to
Yeah.
rectify that.
That's the human response that we should expect of ourselves, but we've even taken that part of our own humanity away in our conversations with these other folks. But one of the other things that I think that I read about or heard about this last week is that the Native Americans did have a theology of land. It was socialist. It was shared. No one owned private property. They might have individual items that they've made that they can give to another, but land wasn't considered something that could be shared with another. It all belonged to Wakantanka. It all belonged to God, right? The Great Spirit. And they would have different language for that, but they had to break the socialist indigenous relationship with land in order to break the people. And that's what came out of this other interview that I heard this week. And that was and continues to be something that I chew on, because there's so much in our culture even today that blames socialism, which wasn't even invented when they were starting the wars with the Indians before, during, and after between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, right?
Yes, I tell you, to be honest with you, I grow silent with all of this because I begin to feel in my own bones what has happened.
Mm.
Is we have literally watered the nation with blood. And I went back into the Declaration of Independence and I was shocked that one of the reasons why our forefathers and mothers wanted to separate from England was because the king said that the colonies could not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. That somehow or another we had to learn to live with the people that were here. And that was considered favoring the barbarians, as if there was nothing to learn. There was nothing to experience. The other thing is the disease and the mayhem that came from European culture, civilization, to these lands. Once you have that mindset, I have nothing to learn from you. Now, I know people are going to react to this somewhat and say, well, not everybody. That may be true, as we see with Charles V. But the fact is, we know what the outcome is. All we have to do is look at the United States today and how we behave toward indigenous people, and it's not even apologetic. We still think that we have a right to plow their lands, to go straight through the land with a pipe, to pollute their waters, to simply ignore their humanity. And if we won't even recognize their humanity, how in the world will we recognize their God-given rights, not the rights we give them? We could say the Doctrine of Discovery is a fluke. While it's the teaching of the church and became even the practice in Christianity and entered into American law, jurisprudence, our legal way of thinking, and even the way we hold real estate. It's our fluke. It came from us, and we're responsible for it, even if we're not guilty for it. I'll say this, well, by way of conclusion, if I may. Is this true Christianity? The question that comes up before me that I haven't seen too many people wrestle with is, where did the Doctrine of Discovery come from? What was in the root before the Doctrine of Discovery that led to the Doctrine of Discovery? And in my next reflection, I hope to examine that a little bit. What's behind the doctrine of discovery? What were some of the elements in the tradition prior to the 15th century that led to such a horrific way of thinking and the consequences it has today? And also, if we could formulate a doctrine of discovery that destroyed so many people, can we also invent a doctrine of conciliation, seeking forgiveness, by which we might change the face of the earth?
So how can just knowing this make the difference for us? Most folks have never heard of the doctrine of discovery. I never heard of it until I heard it at the Presbyterian Church General Assembly as they were talking about an overture to come out publicly against it. Some denominations have done that. How do we, what is the, how do we use this information in ways that are life-giving for others and ourselves? And even correction for the Christians who want to, who don't want their Christianity to be something that is influenced by this.
Well, perhaps I have two responses. One is perhaps we need to forego our addiction to what do I do with this and how do I make things better, and to sit with it, to feel it, to become aware of it, to let it sink in. And instead of talking to ourselves about what we might do, perhaps we need to speak to Indigenous people about what we might do. Maybe it's time for us to do what wasn't done when the land was discovered. Hello, how are you? We are visitors from afar. We didn't know you were here. How wonderful it is to meet you. Tell us what your life is like, how you feel about things. We don't want to be invaders, but companions. Maybe we need to sit with the pain. Maybe we need to sit with the shock and not immediately try to respond to it, because I think sometimes in the helping of other people, what we're really trying to do is to get rid of the guilt or the shame or the remorse or the brokenness. And I think maybe we need to sit with it.
The
And
soul
then
angst.
talk to the people who were damaged by this.
But that's harder to do here in California because of the California Indigenous genocide. I mean, after the 49ers ran out of gold, our state conspired with the federal government to pay $1 to $5 for scalps or whole heads of Indigenous people so that there wouldn't be First Nations here that had land, that had, there was this recognition that the colonization in the other parts of the country weren't as complete as they could have been. And so here in California, we took money from our own coffers and got money from the federal government to pay folks to put an end to these nations so that there wouldn't be a reservation in Oakland for the Lejeune Ohlone people. And we've taken all their sacred spots. We've bulldozed their shell mounds. We've even put communication material up on top of Mount D on Toyushtuk, the way that the Ohlone used to talk about that sacred mountain where their medicine men lived. And no one it was so sacred, no one but the medicine men lived there. We don't have
And
the same relationship with the land that they do, and we've done so much development that it's even hard for us to give land back. When Vallejo tried to do so in the Sigoriate area of Glen Cove, they promised all sorts of things, and then they ended up paving over and breaking their promises in preserving the naturalness of the state, of the
well,
sacred
that's what I
lands
mean
there.
when I say if if we go in with the mentality how we're going to fix this while we're still doing the damage, until we come to the realization that this is not what was done, this is what's going on now.
It's
It
continuing.
yeah, this isn't over. This isn't like, oh, our ancestors did this. We're still doing it now. And we may be, some of us may be unconscious and oblivious to it, but I think that may turn out to be a moral fault. Now, the other thing we could do, we could reformulate Christian religious education in the United States. Maybe it will be required that every baptized Christian who's in formation to adulthood would spend a month on with indigenous people. That to be a better me, I need to meet you. And it would be particular in this country to the people who were particularly damaged. So maybe part of our formation and becoming who we are is to meet who you are so that we might never do again in the name of Jesus what we've done.
Yeah, we sent our confirmands to Jewish or Muslim faith communities or non-Protestant faith communities to go to a Catholic worship service as a part of their confirmation, so that they could learn how other Christians worship, but also how Christian worship is influenced by Jewish worship and other things like that. I think I did recognize that there are folks that are experiencing the current treaty rights fight in Minnesota as if it's a continuation of the genocide. Because our government basically said, we know that we signed this document that you have the rights to hunt and fish and protect all of the relatives that you hunt and fish in these areas in exchange for living in a smaller reservation within that area. But if they're not going to, if they're not going to protect it, it's like telling them that they really want Native people to be dead.
See, I think sometimes in our mentality, we want to go help people produce more. We really think there's something about our economic way of being and our cultural way of being that is just a blessing for everybody else. Pope Francis in the encyclical Laudato Si said, we must meet the indigenous of the world if we are going to survive as the human race. We have to get rid of this idea that we're missionaries, that we're always going out trying to save somebody. The time has finally come when we who are missionaries are going out to discover how to be saved, how to finally reverence the air, to live on the land as if it's our common home, rather than my plaything and my personal possession. We have to get rid of the mentality that deep down inside we're going to meet the indigenous or other people because we're going to be of help to them. It's no wonder they're suspicious when many of us show up. What is your definition of help? But now we need their wisdom if we would survive as a human family.
And they're afraid that their wisdom is just going to get sold and offered as if it wasn't indigenous wisdom again by whoever does training with an indigenous leader. That kind of appropriation of indigenous technologies that, like fire, that kept California going as long as it did. And when we stopped doing the same fire practices that they were doing, has contributed to the amount of wildfires that we're having and the problems that we're having.
That's why I hope and pray, and I hope that the people that we're working with right now, that this is a turning point. I don't know that. I hope that. I will work for that this is a turning point.
And it's not just in Minnesota, it's Oak Flat, Arizona, that Senator McCain helped give away a part of the Oak Flat Reservation without their permission. He got Congress to pass it, and that's all it took for them to give away that to a foreign. It wasn't even an American mining company. I think it's an Australian company, right?
Because deep down in our consciousness, deep down in the DNA of our bones, they don't have any rights. So on the surface, we may say they do, but we've lived in a systemic way by which the humanity has been denied.
How do we reclaim our own humanity when we've been a part of systems that have done this to our siblings?
One is to, I believe this deeply, is to let your heart be broken and sit with it, to sit with the pain and the sorrow and the tears. And if that doesn't touch the core of us, well, then we are doomed. I don't particularly believe that. I believe that when people receive this kind of information and work with it, it's heartbreaking, yes. And I would suggest that teachers and leaders not be too quick to take the pain away, but let the pain set in. That creates sympathy, empathy, compassion, justice.
I would argue you can't get to the justice part until you've done the real atoning, right? The real forgiveness, the real apologies, the real restitution, even.
Yeah, and I don't know how the world you would have. To me, this would mean a life-changing event. We need to recover from former ways of thinking, which means that it is how do we live our lives from this day forward. Otherwise, we're going to say, well, we repented from that and we repaired the damage. This is one damage that cannot be repaired.
As the residential schools and the stolen children point out
That's
to
right.
us.
We will have to live with this.
And it wasn't
And
just
we will have to
Catholics, it
cope
was
with this.
Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Methodists and Mormons and everyone from many, many different traditions that were a part of that.
But it
whole
must
system.
become part of our history. It must become part of our factual history and not be a politically expedient game that certain unscrupulous people play to get votes.
Yes.
It has to be part of our story. We need to be in recovery, and recovery is a lifelong issue.
12 steps for colonialists and their children who have learned their ways, and we've been socialized as colonialists. Maybe that's one way of recognizing that we've been socialized into this, right?
Yeah, you're hearing parents say they don't want a particular curriculum because it gets their child upset. Who ever heard of such a thing? You're going to live life and not be upset. The question is not how do you not get upset. The question is what do you do when you do get upset?
Well, the irony about CRT is that it's only usually taught in law schools. It's not taught in even most colleges, unless you're doing racial and ethnic studies. And usually only in master's programs. But now they're blaming that that's what all of the desire to do our own racial work is.
Well, that's one of the signs to being traumatized, because you go into denial. You go into revisionist history, where you blame the people you victimized. So that makes perfect sense to me.
So this is heavy, and we're going to sit in this heaviness. We're going to keep staying here, and we're going to recognize that we're halfway through our curriculum. There's even more for us to learn about nationalism. This is key. Do you want to give us some idea of where the next two conversations are going to go in our curriculum that we're creating right now?
Well, I would like to go into some more material about where did the doctrine of discovery come from. Because I think something to take it back to discovery, which many people do, and then say, well, that was the root cause. I'm still left with the deep question, where did the doctrine of discovery come from? And what were the implications of that? That will lead us into the dynamic relationship between nationalism and racism. Because as far as I'm concerned, there are three areas that we have to be sensitive in that to, and that is the whole issue of women's rights and dignity, the indigenous, and then and genocide, and then slavery. Slavery was not an incident in American history. So we need to look at this. And then finally,
and slavery is in some of our holy scriptures, and apologies for slavery as well.
That's why I
So
want
we
to go
really need
back to
to,
yeah,
we really
what
need
are
to
the
dig
root
deeper there.
causes of where the doctrine of discovery came from? And so that means examining our deep roots, which can be very, very painful again, but I think very, very enlightening. Because the very, very scriptures that were used to oppress people are the very, very scriptures that oppressed people use to become free. So there may not be anything magical in the verse, but there may be something sensational in the soul, in the heart, in the flesh of every human being. The very scriptures that we use to put people down are the very, very scriptures that people who were put down used to stand up.
And especially the story of the Exodus. So many different groups have found their story in the story of the Exodus and other stories, right?
Then finally, we'll look at some of the areas of what we might be able to do. What are the antidotes? What are some of the lifestyle changes that we can make? What are some of the positive, constructive things that we can do? But I want to be cautious with that because we're dealing with real people and what happened to real people, many of whom are with us today.
That's right. So if you were to give some homework for us to be prepared for these next two conversations, what are some good things that we should be doing on our own in between this session and the next?
I think the most important thing for people to do is to do a little bit of autobiographical work. What is my story? How do I understand the country in which I live? What is my reaction and my feelings to the information that I'm receiving? As I look back into my life, what is my experience of racism? What's my experience of indigenous people? What was I taught as a child? What was my entertainment? What was my sports entertainment? What did I look at on TV? What were my favorite movies? Did I play cowboys and Indians? What was I thinking? What did that teach me? And then we begin to see it's not some curriculum change out there. It's a heart change in here. This stuff is subtle. It sets into the way we play, the way we think. We can go to the cigar store and there's an Indian. So for each and every one of us to become aware of how this culture of oppression, this culture of repression, this culture of dismissing the humanity of other people, that culture stepped into all of it, into all of us. All of us have been marinated in those juices. So to become aware of it from my own personal perspective and experience can be highly liberating.
And thinking back on the ways we've been socialized is a part of the hard work that we do as we're doing our anti-racism work.
Indeed.
Because our socialization, our education is probably different than almost anyone else's. If there's 2 billion Christians in the world, there's 2 billion Christianities. So our experience may be radically different than other people. Some folks may have actually been able to miss out on some of the things that may still be things that we're working on from our youth or our adolescence.
Pay very close attention to things like the denial. Pay very close attention to revisionist. the fact versus the religion. And also pay very, very close attention to the fact that how many times we blame the victim.
Mm.
And
And
that
maybe
may be
we,
very much part of our life stories.
That might be more central to our own life story than we want to admit.
Absolutely.
I think maybe one other thing that we can do between this segment and the next one is maybe look up where our own faith tradition, what our own faith tradition has said about the doctrine of discovery. Have they made any statements publicly about it? Have they ever apologized to Native Americans and First Nation peoples? That might be some of the kind of things that we can do with Google to learn a little bit more about our own faith tradition and life philosophy's history as well.
Apology and amendments. Apology and what are we willing to make any amends?
Yeah. And maybe we need to talk about atonement in our different traditions and how we make amends in different ways in our different traditions as well. And that might be something that would be unique to whatever faith tradition or traditions that we may be practicing.
Good point.
All right, well, then we're going to wrap up tonight and this episode. Looking forward to the next few conversations that will hopefully help us see the world with clearer eyes. Thank you so much, Father Tom.
Thank you. Be well.
Have a great evening.